Hello friends, welcome back to Code with Roy. Today we'll be learning about JSession ID, and in between of this session I'll explain why I chose this particular topic. Basically, I faced an production issue a couple of days back and it was very difficult to figure out why that was happening, and then later on we figured out this is because of a JSession ID mismatch. So while we'll be going through this presentation, we'll learn what is JSession ID, how it is relevant, what is session, how we store users data in session, and how we maintain sessions among 110,000 members interactions inside a web application. So without wasting any time, let's start. Introduction. JSession ID is a unique identifier used by Java-based web applications to manage user sessions. It helps maintain user-specific data across multiple requests. So to explain it in little more details, whenever we are interacting through a website, if that is a Java-based application, then server automatically creates, when a fast request hits the server from the browser, server automatically creates a session for that unique session for that particular member, and it's tag that session with a JSession ID and pass that JSession ID to the browser as a cookie. What is session? A session is a server-side storage of user data. So for every interaction, for every member's interaction, server creates a session to store that member specific data in that session. It allows state management across multiple HTTP requests, which are stateless by default. What does this mean? There are say hundreds to 10,000 people are interacting in a big website, right? Now, each member has its own data. We cannot mix the someone's information with someone else's information, right? So that's how automatically server maintains that individual session and mark it with the JSession ID. So with that JSession ID, it can, whenever the interaction happens from browser to server, browser to server, browser to server, say multiple interactions happening, right? From we are hitting something from browser, say we are first logging and then we are doing search and then we are doing payments. So every time an interaction happening from browser to server, that time using that JSession ID at server side will automatically figure out that okay, this is our session where we have stored, and it won't get mixed with someone else's session. So next slide we'll go deeper into it. What is JSession ID? JSession ID is a cookie automatically generated by the server when a session is created. It uniquely identifies the user session. It is used to map the request to the stored server session. I hope this is clear. How JSession ID works. So when user fast hit or fast request goes from browser to the server first time creates a session for that member, and server also creates a unique JSession ID and tag that JSession ID with that session and pass that JSession ID to the server back using a cookie. Then when someone hit the next request from the browser to the server, the browser sends that same JSession ID cookie back to the server. Then server fetches, because the JSession ID is unique, right? For that particular JSession ID, it's unique. So using that unique JSession ID, server can fetch the exact correct session for that member, and we can fetch that member informations using that session. I hope now this is clear. We'll move to the next slide where we'll be seeing how this is happening. So if you see here, client browser, fast request, HTTP request went to the server. There was no JSession ID till now. Now when server receives that request, First time server creates a new session in the memory for that particular user interaction, and then it generates a JSession ID. So this is the number, unique number. Server will always generate a unique number for JSession ID using their inside internal algorithm. Then sends back that HTTP response which set the cookie. JSession ID is equal to this one. So then server creates a cookie and send it back to the browser as a HTTP response cookie. Then client browser stores the JSession ID cookie. Next, the next interaction, the next time client browser is sending the request back to the server, this time client browser will pass that JSession cookie in that request header. Then server will reads the cookie. It will find the matching session using that JSession ID because it's unique. And then server can restore that user's data. How server retrieves session using JSession ID. So we are going little more deeper. Client sends request with JSession ID cookie, which we learned the next call, right? From browser to server, we are sending JSession ID in a request cookie, request header cookie. Then browser automatically includes the cookie in the HTTP header. So say this is the cookie getting sent to the server using the HTTP request header. Server reads the JSession ID. Then using that JSession ID, the servlet container checks the request header to find the value of the JSession ID. Okay, so it finds this value. Now session lookup. The server maintains a session stored in memory or distributed cache. So server actually stores hundreds of sessions, right? So say there are 100 users are interacting into the site, then 100 session has been created until unless we invalidate some session by logging out or something else, right? So 100 sessions are there and each session is tagged to a individual JSession ID. So when we send the request from browser to server, we are passing this JSession ID. So server fetches that JSession ID and then it uses that JSession ID to look up the key to find the matching session. So this kind of code are getting executed internally. Server first internally check the JSession ID has been passed, and then using that JSession ID, server finds the session. If you see, session manager finds session inside the JSession ID, but this we do not need to write in a code. It will happen internally through the server. Okay, so server finally finds a correct session for that JSession ID. Cookie versus URL rewriting. Cookie based session tracking, most common. JSession ID stored in browser cookie, which we just saw. Then if sometimes in some applications we disable the cookies. So for that time we can pass JSession ID by appending in the URL, request URL. So this is how we can even pass the JSession ID by doing URL rewriting. How server generates JSession ID? Usually generated by servlet container. So Tomcat or JT, whatever the servlet container we are using for our application server or web server, that basically creates the JSession ID, and it has its own secure random algorithm using which it creates a unique number and create that JSession ID. So ensures uniqueness and security. Code example how to create and retrieve session. I hope you all know this one. So request.get session using, so inside server code we can say it's in a controller, right, which runs inside the server. So we can do request.get session there. That way we can we can get a session and then we can store something inside the session. So say this is the key called username and we are storing this value John Doe into the session. Then while retrieving uh, we can say request.get session, and if a existing session is there, so this time JSession ID will be internally used. It will fetch the same session using the JSession ID, and then from the same session it will retrieve that John Doe by doing session.get attribute, and then this string user will be populated as John Doe. So this is how we can store and retrieve informations from the session. Session lifecycle: creation, when session has been created, when user sends first request, then only session has been created. Active, server stores session data. So until unless we invalidate the session by logging out or by some other mechanism, manually we can write to invalidate session. So until we do that, session will be staying active inside server store. Timeout, auto delete after inactivity. So there will be some default parameter setup as a timeout. Session will be timeout. So if we don't do anything in the browser for such a long time, say like 30 minutes or like that, then server container or sublet container, right, automatically delete that session or inactivate and then delete the session. Invalidating, we can manually invalidate, just as I said, like when we are logging off, then we can manually logged out and session, we can invalidate the session because we won't be using that same session anymore. Relation between session and session ID cookie. What are the relation? The session and the JSession ID cookie are tightly connected. Think of them as a server-side data store. So session, where we store the data, and key is the JSession ID, which is mapped to a session. So the JSession ID helps the browser identify which session belongs to the user. So see the relationship. Session, where it lives, it's stored on the server. JSession ID, it's stored on the browser, user's browser, as a cookie. What it contains? Server contains user specific data. We can store anything like username, cart items, login status, etc. and anything like you can store inside the session. What is stored inside the JSession ID? Just a unique identifier, a random string which can uniquely identify a session. Purpose: maintain state across multiple HTTP requests. So because of the session, we can maintain the state of multiple calls, multiple HTTP calls. So say there are 100 people are interacting. So using session, we can keep their interactions or their data separate from each other. JSession ID helps the server to find correct session for the user. So since JSession ID is unique, by sending that unique JSession ID from the browser to the server use that particular JSession ID to identify that individual user session. Who creates it? Session, server, web server creates it, like Tomcat, JT, etc. Who creates JSession ID? Same, web server creates it, automatically sent to the client by server as a cookie. So once JSession ID has been created, it's sent back to the client browser as a cookie. How it works? Session object is stored in server memory. So until unless we invalidate the session or the timeout happens, the session will get stored in the server memory. So server can store thousands of sessions for different members. JSession ID, it will be stored as a cookie. Cookie carries the session ID back to the server on every request. So whenever we are sending consecutive requests from browser to server, it will pass as a cookie, and then server can fetch that JSession ID and retrieve the correct session using that JSession ID. How they work together step by step. So client sends first request, no session exists yet. Server creates the first session when it's got the first request. A session object is stored on the server. Server generates JSession ID. This is uniquely identifies that particular session. Server sends that JSession ID to the client as a cookie. Client send this cookie back to each request. So after all consecutive requests, client will send that cookie back to the server as a request header. Browser automatically includes JSession ID in the request header. Server uses JSession ID to retrieve the matching session. So using that JSession ID, server will retrieve the correct session for that particular member or user. The session is the actual data stored on the server. JSession ID is just a reference, like a key or pointer to that session. Without JSession ID, the server wouldn't know what session the incoming request belongs to. And we'll be seeing in an example soon. When this JSession ID created, when the first call receives the server, say when we hit like this request.get session, so we create a first session, when server creates a session, and then it's also create a JSession ID and map that session with the JSession ID, or any other session related API is used. How server retrieves session? It looks up session storage using the JSession ID value. So when we are passing the JSession ID from the browser request header to the server, server will fetch that JSession ID and search in session store using the JSession ID to retrieve the session. Maps ID to a session object stored in memory or distributed cache. Real world example, user logs into banking website. Server creates session with account details. JSession ID ensures only that user accesses their data. Distributed session. Now I'll tell you the story, why I chose this topic and what issue we faced in our production environment. So distributed session, so say we are using microservices, or we are using applications where we have multiple pods or multiple instances where same application is running, right? Say we have 5 different instances where application is running. So what will happen? Browser means the first request went to say instance 1, and it's created a JSession ID and added it back to the browser and passed it back to as a cookie to the browser, right, to the client. And then the next request, if the next request goes to that same instance 1, then it's easy. Instance 1 already has that session stored, and using that JSession ID it can fetch that data. But if the next request goes to instance 2, instance 2 doesn't have, because instance 2 has the session but it doesn't have the old session which is stored in instance 1. So that JSession ID won't find the actual session in instance 2. So that's where we need to use the sticky session, so that one member's call will go to that instance 1 always, where that JSession ID will find the session. So what happened in our scenario, we moved from EC2 instances to Kubernetes because we are doing a containerization of our application. So that time sometimes the calls were going to a different pods where the JSession ID was not finding the old session, and that's where application was failing. So JSession ID and load balancer. Sticky sessions ensures request goes to same server. So this is basically we need to do some configuration so that this sticky session can be achieved. So in these sticky sessions, if we have multiple instances, for one particular user call should go to one server or one instance where the same correct session is stored. Or else what we needs to do, which didn't happen for us when we moved to Kubernetes, we need to have a centralized session store. Means we need to use a database or Redis, which will be uh, shared across all the server instances. So summary, JSession ID is critical for tracking user sessions, actually managed by server, used to maintain state across HTTP requests. So this is it all about JSession ID. Now let's see an real-time example how this been used in our application. So say I have this application which I know is a Java based application. So let me try to do a booking. So if you see, okay, I need to re-log in. I don't know why it's logging me out. Let me try once again. Okay, looks like okay. So I'm inside the application. Let's open the network tab to see how we can see it. So I'll do one transaction, right? Say I'll try to book something and then I need to go to the network tab. So see this list view call, right? So if you see this list view call and this is the call happens which went to server, and if you see here the request header, so this is the response header and there will be a request header. So um, you see this is the JSession ID. So if you see this JSession ID starts with AEF91 and blah blah blah, right? So throughout the interactions for this user, right? I logged in as a user. Now whatever interactions I'll do, it will always find out this JSession ID, and because of that it will maintain the session. Whenever this JSession ID changes, it cannot retrieve its informations from the actual session. So if you see, just note it down, this JSession ID starts with AEF9, and let's say if some other calls happens, not here, let me try to do some other thing, available units. So I called available units, and if you see the call available units, no, where is that call? Okay, I'll say here, no, this is a different site. So what I have to do first, I need to do some add some filter. I know this application, so that's how I know this is a Java based application. So okay, so see here now, say I will try to do available units. Now you see this call, and if you see here as well, the request header, you will see the same JSession ID. You see AEF, the same JSession ID. So JSession ID has been retained. So what happened? The first call happened, right? The search call, and then it returned the response back to the browser, but it passed that JSession ID cookie to the browser header. and then this call we pass that JSession ID back to the server using this request header. So this is, if you see, this is a request header for this call, and we are passing the same JSession ID to the server. So what server will do, using this JSession ID, server will identify this user session in the server and can automatically fetch the data from that session. Else it won't find the required data from the session and application will fail. So this is a very interesting thing which server maintains automatically just to keep the state of a application or state of HTTP requests, right, of an application. So this way, even we have 100 users are interacting in the site, uh, we cannot, like, corrupt or overlap someone else's data. So the state will be maintained. So this is what I wanted to show you in application. So whatever I do now, even if I try to book it now, some other call will happen. Payment options. Here also, if we see, no, not this one, this is, means whatever call happens now, request header. I don't know if we can see. Okay, some call happened. Where is that call? Um, Payment option, response header, request header. We should see that JSession ID. Yeah, you see. So the same JSession ID is retained. So any call happens now, we are sending the same JSession ID back to the server so that we can retrieve the same correct member session. So this is it for now. If you understood this video, please like and subscribe my channel. Means like this video and subscribe my channel, and please share this video as well as the channel with your friends who are, like, in IT or doing or learning rather applications, mainly Java. So I hope it will be a help for them. I'll keep bringing new topics which are relevant for your industry. That's it. Thanks a lot. Bye for now, and we'll come back with a new topic soon. Thanks. Bye.